You can't sit here, my grandson said, his young voice sharper than the clinking of silverware, cutting deeper than any knife on that table. It wasn't shouted, it wasn't even cruel in tone, but it carried the finality of a slammed door. For a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. The Christmas lights strung across the restaurant windows glowed with a false warmth, golden halos spilling onto the frosted street, but inside my chest the air turned cold. Families laughed around us, chairs pulled close, toasts rising in the holiday air. And yet, before my own family, I was a stranger. I had walked in quietly, coat folded over my arm, my heart carrying no demands. I had wanted only to share a meal, to feel the comfort of belonging at the same table where I had once raised them, where I had once carried the weight of their futures on my shoulders. I did not expect grandeur, nor speeches, nor even thanks. Just a seat, just a place. That was all. But the chair I had reached for, empty, waiting, positioned between the boy I had cradled as an infant and the daughter whose hand I had held when she was afraid of the dark, was snatched from me with a sentence. You can't sit here. The words sank like stones. My son's eyes darted away, as though the shame belonged to me and not to him. My daughter smoothed the tablecloth, pretending to be lost in thought. Not one voice rose to say, "Of course you can." Not one hand reached to pull out another chair. Betrayal, I realized then, doesn't always come in storms and shouts. It comes in silences too loud to ignore, in the turning of eyes that once sought you out, in the absence of defense when your dignity is cut down by a child too young to understand the cruelty in his own words. The waiter passed by with menus tucked under his arm, casting a polite glance in my direction, but my family avoided even that. They looked at each other, not at me, and in that unspoken agreement, they erased me from the center of their world. I slid to the edge of the table, to a chair near the aisle, where the drafts from the door brushed cold against my back. I told myself it didn't matter, that food tastes the same whether you sit in light or shadow, but it did matter. Every clink of their glasses felt like laughter pointed at me. Every smile shared across the table felt like a wall I could no longer pass through. Still, I stayed. Not because I was welcome, but because leaving would have meant admitting they had succeeded in pushing me out. I would endure the edge of the table, the icy draft, the silence. I would endure my grandson's smirk and my son's avoidance. For now, because the night had not yet shown its full hand, and truth, though buried, always has a way of finding its way to the surface. Friends, let's take a small pause. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Has something like this ever happened to you? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video. This way you help us grow this channel and bring more stories to life. Now let's continue. He saw it immediately, the empty chair beside his grandson. For a fleeting moment, relief swept through him, fragile as glass. Perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps this Christmas meal would not carry the familiar weight of silence and exclusion. That single chair was a promise, a place waiting for him, a chance to belong again at the table where his laughter once rang louder than all the rest. He moved toward it slowly, careful not to hope too much, careful not to believe in what might crumble beneath him. But the boy's eyes met his, sharp and unyielding, colder than the winter air outside. There was no innocence there, no unawareness. It was the kind of gaze a child learns by watching, a cruelty inherited, copied, repeated. And then came the words, short, simple, carrying the sting of a verdict. You can't sit here. The relief shattered instantly, as if someone had dropped a crystal glass onto stone. He stopped mid-step, his hand tightening on the back of the chair he had meant to pull out. The table filled with the hum of conversation, but none of it reached him. His son cleared his throat, staring down at his plate. His daughter shifted uncomfortably, adjusting her napkin, pretending she had not heard. Not one voice rose in protest. Not one voice defended him. The boy's rejection hung in the air like a curtain, and everyone let it fall. He felt the weight of generations pressing down on his shoulders. The same grandson who once clung to his leg, who once fell asleep on his chest, now treated him like an intruder, a shadow taking up too much space, and worse, the adults allowed it. They permitted the insult to breathe, to live, to spread. They had turned their silence into permission, their indifference into agreement. He let go of the chair slowly, as though it burned beneath his hand. The smile he forced onto his lips was brittle, a mask cracking at the edges. He stepped back, swallowing not only the rejection, but the truth it revealed. In their eyes, he was not family tonight. He was a guest without invitation, a figure tolerated at best, forgotten at worst. He moved toward the far edge of the table where no one waited, where no hand pulled out a seat for him. The draft from the doorway touched his back as he sat down, a cold reminder of how near he was to being outside altogether. He folded his hands in his lap and stared at the glow of candles flickering in crystal holders, mocking the warmth that had once defined Christmas. The laughter of his children and grandchildren washed over him, like waves crashing against a rock, loud, careless, unbroken. He was not included in their stories. He was not asked about his day. He was a silent figure at the corner, existing only in the periphery of their celebration. And though he sat among them, he had never felt further away. The words echoed in his chest long after they had been spoken, sharper than they had any right to be. It was a simple refusal, a childish command, yet it pierced deeper than years of labor, deeper than the weight of sacrifices no one at that table had ever seen. He sat in his corner, the draft curling against his back, and tried to steady his breath, but each inhale came ragged, as though the air itself resisted him. He looked around the table, searching, hoping for even the smallest defense, the faintest kindness. None came. His son shifted his fork, pretending not to have heard, eyes fixed stubbornly on the meat before him. His daughter stared at her wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly, as if the crimson whirlpool might drown the shame she refused to face. The silence was worse than the boy's words. Silence meant agreement. Silence meant consent. It was not the cruelty of a child that crushed him. It was the cowardice of grown men and women who had once depended on him for everything. He remembered the nights he had stayed awake, fixing leaks in their childhood home so they would sleep warm. The mornings he had risen before dawn to earn enough that they might never know hunger. And yet here, in the golden glow of the restaurant, with candles burning and laughter spreading from every other table, his life's devotion was erased with averted eyes and tightened lips. His grandson's rejection had only been the spark. Their silence was the fire that consumed him. The room pressed down on him. Laughter from other families rang like distant bells, joyful and cruel by contrast. He wondered how many of those fathers and grandfathers at neighboring tables were still cherished, how many still had seats waiting beside their children. The thought twisted inside him, and he forced his eyes downward, staring at the white cloth beneath his folded hands, searching for steadiness in its stillness. But even there, the faint trembling of his fingers betrayed him. He clasped them tighter, trying to hold together the fragments of dignity that threatened to scatter across the floor. He wanted to speak, to remind them of who he was, of what he had given, of how fragile their comfort would be without the foundation he had laid, stone by stone, year by year. But the words caught in his throat, turning to ash before they could form. Because what use was truth to ears that had chosen not to hear? What use was memory to those who had already erased it? He swallowed, forcing the bitterness down, though it scalded him more than any wine ever could. The waiter passed by again, carrying trays heavy with plates, and for the briefest second the man's eyes flicked toward him with a spark of recognition, of respect. It was small, fleeting, almost unnoticeable, but it was enough to remind him that not all the world had forgotten. Still, when he looked back to his family, their faces closed to him, their voices moving past him as though he were not there, he felt the weight of abandonment settle on his chest until each breath came shallow, stifled, aching. He pulled out the chair at the far corner, its wooden legs dragging faintly against the polished floor, a sound no one acknowledged. It was a seat no one had prepared for him, no one had thought to leave open, no one had wanted filled. He lowered himself into it slowly, each movement carrying the weight of humiliation, as if every eye in the restaurant, not his family's, but strangers, might see and wonder why the elder of the gathering sat so far from the heart of his own blood. The distance between him and the center of the table was only a few feet, but it felt like miles, a canyon carved by years of dismissal, widened now by a boy's casual cruelty. From the corner, the sounds of their celebration reached him strangely distorted. The clinking of glasses rang louder than before, sharp and hollow, as though mocking him, as though every toast was raised against his absence. Laughter floated over him but never touched him, ricocheting from one face to another while skipping past his own. He watched the play of candlelight on their smiles, the easy rhythm of their conversation, and realized that his silence had been woven into the evening as though it were expected, as though it were his only contribution. He was not part of their circle. He was the shadow beyond it. He glanced at his grandson, who leaned comfortably against his father, whispering something that drew an approving nod. Once that boy had run into his arms after scraped knees and nightmares. Once had begged for another story before bed. Now he had become the hand that pushed him away. His son, the man he had raised with calloused hands and endless patience, sat proud in the center, laughing in time with the others, careful never to look in his direction. His daughter's smile was thinner, fragile, but she too looked elsewhere, choosing the safety of silence over the risk of acknowledgement. Their betrayal did not need words. It lived in every glance avoided, every gesture withheld. The cold draft from the entrance slipped behind him again, brushing his neck, a constant reminder that he was closer to the door than to the warmth of family. It seemed fitting. He had been pushed out long before this night. Tonight was only the moment it became undeniable. He straightened his back, refusing to shrink, but inside, a fracture deepened. He felt invisible, yet the pain of being unseen was sharp enough to make him bleed. He let his eyes rest on the tablecloth, tracing the patterns woven into the fabric, trying to anchor himself, trying not to let the tide of humiliation pull him further under. Still he remained. Not to cling, not to beg, but because leaving would mean surrendering the last thread that still connected him to them. He would endure the corner seat, endure the laughter that passed over him, endure the cold air at his back, because sometimes the greatest act of defiance is simply to stay, to bear witness, to remind the world, even in silence, that you are still there. The laughter came first in fragments, hushed and sharp, like broken glass scattered across the table. It wasn't the warm laughter that binds families together. It was the sly, knowing kind, the sort that feeds on cruelty disguised as amusement. From the edge where he sat, each note reached him clearer than they realized. They spoke as though he weren't there, as though his chair at the corner erased his ears along with his place. He heard his name once, wrapped in a chuckle, followed by the words, "Old habits." Another voice added, "Always so quiet, always so stubborn." Their tones were light, casual, but every syllable cut into him, deeper than any deliberate insult ever could. He gripped his napkin in his lap, the cloth twisting under his hands. He could feel the heat rising behind his eyes, but no one noticed, not his son, who was too busy smiling at the jokes, nor his daughter, who let the words slip past her lips with a small laugh, betraying herself in that sound. They were laughing at him, while he sat only steps away, close enough to bleed with every careless word, close enough to remember the days when his quiet ways were their anchor, when his habits were what had kept food on this very table. They had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, how many nights his silence was not weakness, but sacrifice. The silence of a man who carried burdens alone so his children could sleep without fear. They mocked the hands that had once built their safety, the patience that had once shaped their paths. To them, his quietness now was emptiness. His restraint was irrelevance. And yet, in that silence, he was screaming louder than all of them. He stared at his grandson, the boy who had been the first to push him aside that evening. The boy laughed too, not fully understanding the words, but eager to join, eager to belong to the circle that excluded its elder. He was learning cruelty, not from instinct, but from example, repeating the pattern of betrayal taught to him in the safety of a holiday meal. The man's heart ached more for that than for himself, for the legacy of disrespect being passed down like an heirloom. The clinking of glasses punctuated their jokes, each toast like a bell tolling his exile. The candles flickered, throwing shadows across their faces, but none of those shadows reached them the way they swallowed him. He sat still, forcing his breath to remain steady, though every whisper across the table pressed down heavier and heavier against his chest. It wasn't just laughter, it was erasure, a rewriting of who he was, reducing his life to quirks, his sacrifices to inconveniences, his dignity to silence. And yet he did not rise. He did not speak. He endured, because deep within him he knew the truth had its own weight, a weight that one day would press back harder than their mockery ever could. He let their whispers fill the air, knowing that sooner or later the air itself would turn against them. The waiter approached with the quiet confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Menus balanced neatly in his hands, a practiced smile ready to meet the faces at the table. He moved as though nothing could disturb the rhythm of service. But then his eyes fell on the man sitting at the edge, half swallowed by shadow, and in that instant the waiter's steps slowed, the easy rhythm faltered, and his expression changed. The polite mask slipped into something deeper, something warmer, something rare. His eyes widened, not in surprise alone, but in recognition. It was only a heartbeat, a pause so brief the family barely noticed, but to the old man it felt like the world itself had stopped to breathe. For the first time that evening, someone's gaze truly found him. Not out of obligation, not out of pity, not even out of family duty, but out of respect. Respect so clear it could not be mistaken. The waiter did not turn to the son in the center or the daughter leaning forward to be heard. He did not offer the first menu to the grandson who had claimed a seat that was never his to give or take. Instead, he stood still, his hands lowering slightly, and bowed his head just enough that the gesture carried weight. The old man felt it immediately, an acknowledgement that pierced through the thick fog of betrayal. For a moment, he was no longer invisible. He was not a shadow cast out of the circle. He was seen, and in that look, remembered. The silence of his family, their careless laughter, their whispered mockery, all of it collided against this single pause, and suddenly their judgment seemed smaller, more fragile, like brittle glass that could crack at the slightest touch. The family shifted uncomfortably, though none of them said a word. The son cleared his throat, trying to redirect attention, as though he feared the spotlight slipping away from him. The grandson squirmed, confused, unable to understand why a stranger's glance carried such reverence. The daughter fidgeted with her napkin, eyes darting to the waiter, then quickly away, pretending she hadn't seen what everyone had seen. But it was too late. The shift in air was undeniable. The waiter's pause was not the kind that comes from hesitation. It was the kind that comes from recognition of importance. It was the kind of pause a person makes before addressing someone who matters, someone whose presence carries weight beyond the surface. And though the waiter said nothing yet, though the moment passed in silence, it was heavy with meaning. It reminded the old man that dignity cannot be erased by betrayal, that respect sometimes comes not from those bound by blood, but from those who understand the value of what has been built, given, endured. He sat straighter in his chair, the draft still pressing cold against his back, but no longer strong enough to bow him. The family had tried to erase him with silence, but here, in the eyes of a stranger, he found something they had denied him all evening: honor. And though no words had been spoken, the balance at the table had already begun to shift. The waiter bent his head ever so slightly, the gesture carrying more weight than a dozen words could have. It wasn't the polite nod reserved for any customer. It was deeper, more deliberate. The kind of bow one gives to someone whose presence deserves reverence. Then came the words, spoken with warmth that cut through the chill pressing against the man's back. "Good evening, sir." The tone was unmistakable, layered with respect, with recognition, with gratitude that went beyond the simple rituals of service. The family froze for a fraction of a second. His son's fork paused mid-air. His daughter blinked quickly as though she had misheard. Even the grandson tilted his head, confused by the weight of the greeting. But almost as soon as the moment arrived, they tried to wave it away. The son chuckled faintly, brushing it off. The daughter leaned closer to her child, distracting him with whispers. They dismissed it, clinging to the idea that the world still revolved around them, that the respect given to the man at the edge was nothing but coincidence, a fluke of polite manners. But it wasn't. The old man felt it in the marrow of his bones. The warmth in the waiter's voice carried memory, recognition, a truth unspoken. It wasn't the detached tone used for strangers. It was the careful, weighted address of someone who understood the worth of the person sitting before him. And for the first time that evening, something shifted inside the old man. The humiliation still pressed against his ribs, but alongside it now was a small, steady ember of dignity, glowing against the cold. He answered only with a quiet nod, but in that nod was centuries of strength, a silent reply that needed no elaboration. He did not glance at his son to see the discomfort flickering across his face. He did not seek his daughter's acknowledgement or his grandson's confusion. Instead, he allowed the moment to stand on its own, unshaken, undeniable. The clinking of glasses resumed, forced and brittle. The conversation rose again, but with cracks in its surface, like ice beginning to splinter. They could laugh and speak as they pleased, but they could not erase what had just passed between the waiter and the man in the shadows. Someone had seen him, honored him, addressed him as if he were the most important presence at the table, and though his family tried to bury that truth under chatter and denial, it lingered in the air, too heavy to vanish. The man remained still, his hands resting calmly on the table, his back straightened. He did not need to remind them who he was. The world had a way of speaking for him, of returning dignity when those closest had stripped it away. And tonight it had begun with a bow and two simple words that cut louder than all their silences combined. He sat still, the warmth of the waiter's words lingering in his chest. But as the laughter and chatter of his family filled the air again, shadows of betrayal rose around him. His mind, unbidden, slipped back through years that had taught him this silence was nothing new. He remembered birthdays where his chair at the table had been left empty, though he had paid for the very food they ate. He remembered anniversaries when his name was left unspoken, as if the decades of his devotion could be brushed aside like crumbs from a tablecloth. He remembered sacrifices so heavy they had bent his body but gone unseen by the very people whose lives they had secured. Tonight was no different. It was simply another chapter in a long pattern of erasure. Yet still something stirred in the air, faint but undeniable, like the first crack of light through a closed curtain. He let his gaze wander across the table, His son's laughter was louder than it needed to be, forced, as if to drown out the discomfort that still lingered from the waiter's bow. His daughter leaned toward her child, whispering a story, pretending not to notice the fracture that had just opened. The grandson, smug in his seat at the center, picked at his food with the casual cruelty of youth, unknowing that the arrogance he wore so easily had been bought with another man's sweat, another man's silence. Their betrayal was not new, but tonight it seemed sharper, almost desperate, as though the weight of their denial was finally meeting resistance. For the old man, each memory sharpened the sting of the present moment. He remembered the winters he had worked late into the night so their homes would stay warm, the summers he had gone without so they could have more, the endless years of giving without being asked, because that was what love demanded. And yet here he was, pressed into the corner, treated as if he were a ghost. His chair had always been close to the door, close to being forgotten, and each year the distance had grown wider. But tonight felt different. It wasn't only humiliation pressing against him. It was something else, something rising in quiet defiance. Perhaps it was the recognition in the waiter's eyes, or perhaps it was the weight of memory itself refusing to be silenced. The betrayal no longer felt invisible. It no longer felt like something he had to carry alone. For the first time, the air seemed to shift, as though the truth of who he was, of what he had given, was stirring just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to break free. He did not speak. He did not rise. He sat calmly, his silence no longer submission but strength, the stillness of a man who knew storms could turn in an instant. His family saw only the shadows they had cast over him, but he felt the presence of something larger, pressing through the cracks. The shadows of betrayal were real, but so was the light beginning to push against them. The chatter swelled around him, a tide of voices that rose and fell without ever reaching his corner. They spoke of work, of vacations, of trivial plans for the coming weeks, their words weaving a wall that shut him out. He sat among them, but he was not part of them. He was a stranger in the very circle he had built with his own hands, his presence tolerated but never acknowledged. Each laugh that skimmed past him deepened the ache. Each careless story reminded him that his place had been stolen long before tonight. Yet he remained silent, his dignity steady, even as the shadows of betrayal pressed closer. Then the waiter returned, his notebook ready, his pen poised, his manner brisk. He began to move through the rhythm of service, asking what each person desired. But when he reached the far corner, where the old man sat half forgotten, something remarkable happened. He stopped. He did not glance away. He did not move past. He stood perfectly still, his gaze steady, his pen hovering above the page as though time itself had paused. The family continued speaking over him, expecting the waiter to follow their lead, to dismiss the man at the edge as irrelevant. But the waiter refused. His silence cut through theirs, sharper than any command. The son cleared his throat impatiently, trying to order first, but the waiter did not write. The daughter raised her voice to speak, but he did not respond. His eyes remained fixed on the elder, his posture carrying a quiet reverence. It was not defiance, it was respect, undeniable and unshakable. He would not move until the man in the corner had spoken first. A strange heaviness fell over the table. The laughter faltered. The grandson frowned, confused as to why a stranger would hold up the entire family for the sake of someone they had tried to erase. The son shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his authority thinning beneath the weight of the waiter's silence. And the old man, for the first time that night, felt the tide turn. Slowly, deliberately, he lifted his eyes and gave his order in a calm voice, his tone carrying none of the bitterness he had swallowed all evening. It was simple, measured. Yet in that moment, it sounded louder than the rest of the table combined. The waiter bowed slightly as he wrote, his pen moving only after the elder had spoken, as if to confirm what the family had tried to deny, that he was not invisible, not forgotten, not erased. He was the first. The air shifted palpably, like a crack in heavy glass. For the family, it was a small act, almost nothing at all. But beneath the surface, it was everything. The man they had mocked, silenced, and pushed aside had been seen, honored, and placed above them by someone with no ties of blood, no debt of loyalty, only the recognition of truth. And that truth, once given voice, could not be taken back. Unease slipped across the table like a cold draft no one could ignore. It was subtle at first, the quick flicker of the grandson's eyes, the tightened grip of the son on his glass, the way the daughter's smile faltered before she caught herself. The rhythm of the meal had been broken, the waiter's quiet deference, his deliberate choice to wait for the man at the edge, had shifted something none of them could name aloud, but all of them felt. The younger ones could not understand it. Why the stranger in uniform, whose task was to serve, had paused for their grandfather. Why he had bowed his head as though before someone greater than the head of the table. To them, it was inexplicable, almost absurd. How could the man they treated like an afterthought suddenly command such attention without saying a word? They tried to dismiss it. The grandson smirked and whispered something under his breath, a careless attempt to restore control. The son forced a laugh, his voice louder than before, brittle in its effort to cover the cracks forming in the air. The daughter leaned in toward her child, speaking quickly of nothing important, her words too fast, too bright, as though volume could patch the silence that had exposed them. Yet the laughter that rose from their lips no longer rang smooth. It fractured, sharp at the edges, carrying strain instead of joy. The old man watched them quietly, his hands resting on the table, as steady as stone. He did not need to speak. His silence, once their weapon against him, had turned into his strength. They felt it now, the weight of dignity that cannot be mocked away, the unshakable presence of someone who has endured too much to be erased by whispers. The waiter's reverence had drawn a line down the table, splitting it into two worlds, theirs, built on arrogance and pretense, and his, built on truth too heavy to deny. The grandson shifted again, restless, the smirk fading from his face as he realized he could not laugh his way past the moment. The son reached for his wine, drinking deeply, but the tremor in his hand betrayed him. The daughter glanced once toward the man in the corner, her eyes meeting his for only an instant before darting away, unable to bear what she saw there. Calm, unbroken dignity, and a quiet strength that exposed her own silence. The table no longer felt united. Their voices clashed instead of flowing. Their laughter faltered instead of lifting. What had once been harmony was now dissonance, each note cracked by the invisible presence of truth. And though they tried to bury it, though they forced their words louder, their smiles wider, nothing could erase what had been revealed. The power at the table no longer belonged to them. It had shifted, quietly, inexorably, toward the man they had tried to exile into shadow. The boy leaned closer to his mother, his young voice low, but edged with the sharpness of a blade. "Why is he acting like you matter?" The words were not meant for the whole table, but the silence that followed made them louder than any shout. They sliced through the clinking of silverware, through the strained laughter, and landed squarely in the old man's chest. For a moment, the entire table seemed to stiffen. The son shifted uncomfortably, pretending he had not heard. The daughter's face paled, her lips parting as if to scold, yet no sound came. The boy's question lingered, raw and cruel, a reflection of what the others had always thought, but never dared to say aloud. The old man heard it clearly, every syllable heavy with the arrogance of youth, with the inheritance of disdain passed down from those who should have known better. He could have answered. He could have reminded the boy of the countless nights he had carried him in his arms, of the toys bought with coins saved from his own hunger, of the quiet prayers whispered over him when fever threatened his small body. He could have spoken of the roof over his head, the life of comfort he enjoyed, the very restaurant they sat in, a world that had been shaped, in ways the boy would never know, by the hands of the man he dismissed, but he did not. Instead, he folded his hands slowly, deliberately, the motion steady, almost ceremonial. His silence was not weakness. It was a shield, an answer stronger than any rebuke. He would not argue with a child whose words were only echoes of his parents' neglect. He would not beg for a place in a family that had already erased him. His dignity did not need defense. The weight of his composure pressed against the others more heavily than anger ever could. The grandson shifted uneasily, realizing his words had carried further than intended. The son cleared his throat again, his eyes avoiding the man in the corner, afraid of what they might find there. The daughter twisted her napkin in her lap, shame flickering across her face before she smothered it beneath practiced indifference. The entire table seemed to shrink inward, their forced conversation collapsing under the gravity of a single sentence and the silence that followed it. The old man sat still, his folded hands resting calmly before him, his posture unbroken. He had endured their laughter, their whispers, their dismissal, and now their cruelty spoken aloud, but he remained unshaken. His quiet presence, dignified and immovable, had become heavier than all their words combined, and though none of them would admit it yet, they felt the truth pressing in around them, that the one they tried to cast into shadow was the only one at the table who carried a light too strong to be extinguished. The waiter returned, but this time there were no menus in his hands, no casual words of routine service on his lips. His step carried purpose, and his eyes sought only one man, the one seated at the far corner, half in shadow, yet commanding more presence than anyone at the table. He stopped beside him, straightened, and with a quiet reverence that filled the air heavier than any laughter, he spoke. "Sir, as always, thank you for letting us serve in your place. Without your generosity, this restaurant would not stand." The words struck like a hammer against glass. The chatter died instantly. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Glasses trembled in hands, suddenly unsteady. Every sound in the room seemed to fall away, leaving only those words hanging above the table, undeniable, irreversible. The family stared at the waiter as though they had misheard, as though such reverence could not possibly be meant for the man they had pushed aside, the man they had mocked in whispers, the man their grandson had told could not sit among them. But there was no mistake. The truth was spoken aloud, clear and heavy as stone. The old man did not move, his hands still folded calmly before him. His eyes did not flicker with triumph, nor did his lips curl in bitterness. He remained steady, his silence now a roar louder than any rebuke. For the first time, the world beyond their family circle had spoken, and it had chosen him. The weight of his years, the sacrifices they had dismissed, the quiet strength they had mocked, all of it had just been named, acknowledged, honored. His son's face drained of color, pride collapsing under the weight of revelation. The daughter's lips parted, but no words came, her excuses and deflections withering before they could form. The grandson's eyes widened, confusion breaking into something else, something close to fear, as the balance of power he had thought permanent shifted before his very eyes. The waiter's words had torn the veil from their carefully crafted indifference, exposing their betrayal for what it was, blindness in the face of greatness. The silence that followed was suffocating. It pressed against every corner of the table, a silence no one dared to break. The candles flickered more violently now, as if stirred by the truth itself. And in that silence, the old man sat unshaken, the quiet architect of all they enjoyed, the unseen foundation of the very walls around them. They had tried to erase him, but tonight, before strangers and blood alike, his place had been restored, not by argument, not by anger, but by the undeniable truth, spoken in the voice of one who owed him nothing, yet gave him everything. Respect. The family froze as if the very air had turned to stone around them, Glasses lowered mid-toast, the crystal catching the candlelight but no longer sparkling, forks stilled halfway to mouths, trembling in hands that moments before had been steady with arrogance. The waiter's words hung in the air, too heavy to dismiss, too sharp to swallow, and now every eye was forced to turn toward the man at the far corner. The man they had mocked in whispers, the man they had silenced with their indifference, the man they had deemed unworthy of a seat at their table. For a breathless moment, no one spoke. His son's face darkened, the proud mask he wore cracking under the weight of realization. He had built his comfort on the illusion that his father's life no longer mattered, that the foundation could be ignored while he stood tall upon it. Now the truth had shattered that illusion. The very walls around him, the golden lights above his head, the table at which he sat, all owed their existence to the man he had pushed aside. His daughter looked away, shame pooling in her eyes, her fingers twisting the napkin in her lap until it nearly tore. She could not look at the one she had betrayed with silence, because now silence was impossible. Truth had spoken louder. The grandson sat stiff, his young arrogance punctured, his words, "Why is he acting like you matter?" echoing back at him like a curse. He stared at his grandfather with something he did not yet have the courage to name. Fear, awe, confusion. The ground had shifted beneath him, and he realized too late that the man he had dismissed as invisible was the only one in the room whose presence could not be erased. The old man remained still, his hands folded, his expression calm. He did not need to gloat. He did not need to remind them of their cruelty, of the nights and years in which they had reduced him to shadows. The weight of their shame was punishment enough. It filled the silence. It pressed down on every corner of the table. It burned hotter than any rebuke could have. The more they tried to avoid his gaze, the more it drew them in, until they could not help but see him as he was, not forgotten, not irrelevant, not small, but the quiet architect of all they took for granted. The ground had shifted, and they felt it beneath their very chairs. The man they had treated as excess, as old, as unnecessary, was revealed to be the foundation of the night itself. Every bite of food, every drop of wine, every flicker of golden light existed because of him. Their betrayal was undeniable, their shame unmaskable, and though none of them spoke, the truth roared between them. The one they had exiled from the center was the one who owned it all. He did not gloat, he did not scold. No bitterness passed his lips, no triumph gleamed in his eyes. He merely inclined his head, a simple nod to the waiter's words, receiving the gratitude as one accepts something already understood, already known. It was the smallest of gestures, yet it carried the weight of dignity so profound that it filled the room more powerfully than anger ever could. The silence that followed was not his punishment, it was theirs, for they were forced to sit in the truth they had denied, forced to feel the sting of their own cruelty pressed back against them, not by shouting, not by vengeance, but by stillness. The candles trembled, as if stirred by an unseen wind. The clinking of silverware had ceased long ago, and the golden lights above seemed harsher now, exposing every crack in their false composure. His son stared at the tablecloth as though the pattern might offer escape, shame written across his stiffened posture. His daughter's lips trembled, her eyes wet, though she dared not let tears fall, caught between regret and pride too brittle to break aloud. The grandson, once so bold, shrank into his chair, his earlier sneer now a ghost that mocked only himself. The old man sat upright, calm and unbroken. His silence was no longer the silence of exclusion. It was the silence of strength, the silence of a man who needed no defense. Justice had come, not with fury, but with revelation. And revelation is a sharper blade than rage. In that moment, he understood something deeper than the sting of betrayal. He had nothing left to prove. Their scorn had tried to erase him, but the world itself, through the voice of a single waiter, had named him, honored him, revealed him. No insult, no rejection, no silence could undo that. The room belonged to him without his asking. Every corner, every flicker of light seemed to bow in agreement with his dignity. His stillness grew heavier than thunder, his quiet grace louder than a storm. He did not need to speak, because the truth now spoke for him, wrapping itself around each of them like a chain. And as they sat frozen, eyes lowered, hearts burning with shame, he remained exactly as he had been all along, steady, calm, dignified. Justice had arrived, not in vengeance, but in stillness too vast for them to bear. When he rose to leave, the air seemed to shift with him. The chair scraped gently against the floor, yet the sound was louder than any voice at the table. Heads lifted instinctively, as though gravity itself had pulled their gazes toward him, but none could hold it for long. His son dropped his eyes almost immediately, staring into the empty glass he no longer dared to refill. His daughter's hands clenched the napkin so tightly it tore between her fingers. The grandson, once bold enough to sneer, now shrank into silence, the flush of shame burning across his young face. Not one of them spoke. Not one dared to ask him to stay. They had silenced him for so long, and now they found themselves voiceless in his presence. The waiter moved quickly, abandoning his duties without hesitation, rushing to his side as though serving him was an honor above all others. With both hands he lifted the old man's coat, holding it open with the kind of care one reserves for a guest of great distinction. It was not ceremony, it was not for show, it was instinct born of respect. The gesture pierced deeper than any speech could, and its echo filled the room. The family watched, powerless, as the world outside their circle recognized what they had spent years denying, that the man they had cast aside was the true axis of the evening, the one whose presence gave the place its meaning. He slipped his arms into the coat with quiet grace, the fabric settling on his shoulders like a crown worn not in vanity, but in dignity. He did not look around the table to search for apologies, for none were worthy now. He did not wait for recognition from those who had withheld it so long, for the truth no longer required their validation. He walked slowly toward the door, his steps steady, unhurried, each one a testament to the strength of a man who had nothing to prove and nothing left to lose. Behind him, the family sat in the ruins of their pride. The son's authority, so carefully maintained, lay in shreds. The daughter's silence weighed heavier than any denial she had ever spoken. The grandson's arrogance had been stripped away in a single evening, leaving only the raw understanding that he had mocked the very foundation of his own life. Their betrayal hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking, while the man they had scorned left untouched, untarnished, elevated by the dignity they could not take from him. As he stepped out into the night, the winter air embraced him. Not with the chill he had felt at the edge of the table, but with the crispness of freedom. The lights of the restaurant glowed behind him, golden and warm, but they no longer mocked him. They stood instead as monuments to his legacy, to the truth that could not be erased. He had been denied a seat, but in the end he left not as an outcast, not as a forgotten elder, but as the owner in spirit, the benefactor in sacrifice, the architect of every comfort they had taken for granted. His legacy was not written in their words, which had failed him, nor in their silence, which had betrayed him. It was written in walls that stood because of his labor, in warmth that existed because of his sacrifice, in respect that lived in the eyes of strangers who owed him nothing, but gave him everything. His blood had betrayed him, but the world had not. Respect had been carved for him deeper than any wound, etched into the very bones of the place, unerasable, undeniable. And as the door closed softly behind him, leaving the family in their shame and the restaurant in his wake, he knew that, though they had stripped him of a chair, they could never strip him of his name. And a name, once carried with dignity, can outlive even the deepest betrayals.